So let's move to the other phases of the game. Every turn starts with some reinforcements segment and then replacement segment. So for example, moving into turn 2, the allies always place their scheduled reinforcements first, then the Japanese place their reinforcements, and then the allied player places their replacements, which they have a scheduled number of for every turn, and then so do the Japanese. Now, what is the procedure? There is a chart indicating the scheduled reinforcements for every turn, and as you will notice, the longer the game goes, the allied player will have a ton more units on the map because of the reinforcements and replacements. And first it is the allies. So they have to place the reinforcements, which can be headquarters, air units, ground units, or possibly naval units. And they can place their air units in friendly controlled airfields that are in supply from an already existing on the map headquarters. So in an airfield where an already existing headquarters can trace a supply to. And they place their ground units and naval units in a friendly controlled port where they are in supply from an headquarter on the map. And all these destinations cannot be inside an unneutralized enemy zone of influence. I'll give you a particular example. The Japanese have taken control of this air base, which is Teluk-Betung. And for example, this one Air Force has no zone of influence because there is no joint headquarters to possibly activate it. And I remind you that the Dutch units can only be activated by joint headquarters. So there is no zone of influence projected from this Dutch air unit. So assuming this one is in supply, the Japanese have unneutralized ZOE over this hex and this one. So the allies want to place their reinforcements here, which can be either naval units or ground units or headquarters, because all of these units are placed in friendly ports. And they also want to place air units because it is an air base as well. But they can do none of those because the ZOE over here and over here is unneutralized. So the headquarters cannot be placed here. Neither can the naval unit, nor the air unit, nor the ground unit that comes as a reinforcement, because they have to be placed somewhere that it is in supply. Now, the headquarters have to be placed in friendly ports where they are in supply and not in an unneutralized enemy zone of influence. But after they are placed, they cannot use their supply line to allow the placement of friendly units in the same segment. So, for example, let's assume that the allied player places a headquarters here in the port of Soerabaja, and this one could possibly provide supply to the Dutch air unit. However, this is not used during the same segment. The headquarters that is coming as reinforcements only provides supply to the hex it is placed upon. So you cannot use this headquarters to place units and supply them in other hexes, but you can place units that can be supplied from this headquarters here in the hex you placed it. So by using the stacking limit, which is 3 air or ground units and a maximum of 6 naval units, you can place them in the same hex. And once more, this does not provide zone of influence to this air unit during the same segment so that it could possibly allow placement of other units somewhere else. So there could be an argument that if this headquarters is placed here, it provides supply and zone of influence to this unit. So it can be placed here because the zone of influence is not neutralized. And again, this is a chicken and egg question. But trust me, no, you can't do this. There has to be already some zone of influence to allow this placement here. You can't place this here and in retrospect have your air unit suddenly obtain some zone of influence and allow the placement of the headquarters. You have to place it somewhere else. But replacement is another segment. So subsequently, you can use this newly provided supply and zone of influence to place units as replacements. And because the Japanese place the reinforcements right after you, so in the segment right next, this zone of influence is now in effect. So, for example, if the Japanese were not here and they wished to place a unit here in a hex that possibly they are controlling, now they can't place it because the Allies did their reinforcements first, and now this one has zone of influence, and here it is unneutralized, so the Japanese cannot use this important airfield to place their reinforcements. So again, it is first the Allies placing their units in legal placement, using supply only from headquarters that were present on the map before the segment, or using the headquarters just played solely for the hexes they are placed upon. And after placing all their units, then the Japanese, under the same restrictions, can place their own units as reinforcements. But now the zone of influence of the Allies is in effect and will make their life harder. And after the Japanese place their reinforcements, then we go to the replacements. Replacements means to either bring back eliminated units, and again, I'm not referring to these units that are so-called pre-war units because they have this yellow dot, which means they cannot receive replacement. Once they are reduced or eliminated, they cannot be replaced. So if some units of yours has been reduced or possibly eliminated, you can bring it back, or if it was reduced, reinforce it again by using your replacement points. And the restrictions are the same. They cannot be in an unneutralized zone of influence, and they have to be in a hex where they are in supply. So as you can see, the Allies have a ton of replacements every turn, and they can use their ground replacements to either bring back units from eliminated or have them reduced strength units flipped up to full strength. Same for air units and same for naval units, but notice that this is US naval reinforcements. This is not Commonwealth reinforcements. So for example, if Exeter was damaged, which can't receive replacements anyway, but suppose it was a Commonwealth naval unit that could receive replacements, you cannot flick this back or bring it back from the dead by using these US naval replacement points. You can only use it for US naval units. And also, you have some China replacement points, which can only be used to bring back from the dead or flip to full strength Chinese units. And only these ground replacement points, the Chinese ones, can be used for the Chinese units. And the Chinese units, when brought back from the dead pile, always return to this hex, which is Kunming. Also notice that, in addition to all these replacements, the Allied gain one US naval replacement every turn if they control Oahu, their naval base in Hawaii, in the historical Pearl Harbor, which is here. And this is where this guy, the Central Pacific headquarters, led by Admiral Nimitz, is placed. Additionally, in turns 6, 9, and 12, they receive a Commonwealth naval replacements. So one replacement point that can only be used to fix some Commonwealth naval units. If they control any one of hexes Colombo, Trincomalee, which is here, or Townsville, which is here, or Hong Kong, which is here, or Singapore, which is here. If they control none of those, they lose these replacement points. However, a major difference among the Allied and Japanese replacements is that the Allies cannot store their replacements for later. They have to use it possibly right here, right now. If there are no eligible units to receive the replacements, or the Americans for some reason don't want to use their replacements, then they are lost, and they will be doing the replacements again in the next turn, but these ones will be lost. While the Japanese player can store his replacements for later. Now, if you wonder which replacements I mean these ones, for example, the one naval replacements in turn 3 and one in turn 4, they can use this beautiful marker to indicate that they have one or two replacements in store, for example, which they can use next turn if they can't or don't want to use them right now. They receive no air replacements throughout the game, but there are some events that provide air replacements for them, and they can either use them directly or store them for future use during some turns replacement segment. And they receive no ground replacements either, but if we consult this track, they start the game with 12 Japanese divisions in China, and in every turn, they can reduce one or two Japanese divisions to either bring back eliminated ground units in reduced strength under the procedure we mentioned earlier. For example, in friendly controlled ports where they are in supply from a in-supply headquarters and not in a neutralized enemy zone of influence, or possibly flip their reduced ground units into full strength. They can only use 1 or 2 Japanese divisions every turn, and they can use them on the same unit. For example, they can bring this one from the dead and also flip him to full strength. Finally, when it comes to Dutch units, they can receive no replacements. There are no scheduled replacements. If they are reduced or eliminated, that's it. You cannot replace them. So let's now focus on the War in Europe track because it directly affects the reinforcements. As mentioned, every turn the Allies and the Japanese receive reinforcements. But for the Allies, there is one additional problem. Because there is a war ongoing in Europe, they might have to divert some of their reinforcements to Europe, so possibly not receiving their replacements. The war in Europe starts at this level, the 0 level, which means that US reinforcements are delayed, and US divert to Europe range is 0 to 1. Now let's explain what this means. It is turn 2, and they have a lot of reinforcements scheduled to arrive on the map, but they won't be receiving these replacements on turn 2. This will go to the delayed reinforcement box. So, it is turn 2, and all these reinforcements are scheduled to arrive on the map. The Japanese will receive their reinforcements as normally scheduled, but because the war in Europe is on 0, the Allied player will not be receiving these replacements. These will be placed in the delayed reinforcements box, with one exception, headquarters. So this one headquarters will normally be placed. Headquarters can never be delayed. So, for example, if a headquarters has had to conduct emergency movement because the Japanese entered their hex and gained control of it, it is placed on the game turn track to possibly return as reinforcements during the next turn, and it cannot be delayed. Exception, headquarters like this one, which are only 2, the Malaya and Abda, that are carrying the yellow dot, will not be returning as reinforcements. They will be permanently eliminated if forced to reposition. Also, as previously mentioned during the air naval movement, there is a way of strategically moving the air units onto the turn track to return as reinforcements in the next turn's reinforcement segment. This cannot be delayed either. They will return normally. Also, there is one more effect for the war in Europe. Some units of those may have to be diverted to Europe, and these are the US air units and US ground units, but not the US Marines. So, all the green units and also the CVE type naval units, just like this one, for example. This is CVE, so only CVE naval units, not CV or CVL, only this type of carriers might possibly have to be sent to Europe. If this is hard to remember, think that E is for Europe. So you have to make a die roll for all these units that are eligible to be sent to Europe. And now we consult this track again. And as mentioned, the divert to Europe range is 0 to 1. So if you roll a 0 or 1, the unit is sent to Europe, which means that it is placed 3 turns later. So it is turn 2 and it is placed onto turn 5. It is delayed for 3 turns. And when its turn comes again, we again conduct the war in Europe die roll, and it can be further delayed for additional 3 turns. So there are some particular events that drop or increase this track. So if the Allies can bring the war in Europe into positive levels, then there is no effect and all scheduled reinforcements are received normally. So if during 2 they manage to play a war in Europe card and bring the war in Europe track here, then in turn 3 they will receive their turn 3 reinforcements as normally scheduled, and they will also receive the delayed reinforcements that were delayed in turn 2. So both turn 2 and turn 3 will arrive on the map in the same reinforcement segment. Now, if the Japanese manage to play the war in Europe events and drop this further, if we reach this level, the -3, then the war in Europe die roll is 0 to 3, so chances are increased that some units are diverted to Europe. And then if we reach this level 3, which is -5 or -6 war in Europe track, then the die roll range is 0 to 5, and US loses its amphibious shipping point reinforcements. So I remind you that in turn 1 they have no ASP, then the Allies gain 1 ASP every turn, so they gain 1 amphibious shipping point and have 1 in the second turn. And in turn 3 they have 2 amphibious shipping points, and so on. But if war in Europe reaches this level, then they also lose their amphibious shipping point. And if it reaches this one level, then not only they lose the amphibious shipping point that they would be gaining every turn, but the divert roll for Europe is from 0 to 7, and also they draw 1 card less. So I remind you that there is only 4 ways to reduce the cards the Allied player draws. One is if Australia surrenders, they receive 1 card less every turn for the rest of the game. Then it is China surrender, then India surrender. And finally, this one is the 4th way of having 1 less card dealt if war in Europe reaches this low. Now, let's talk inter-service rivalry. Historically, both sides in the war experienced inter-service rivalry issues, which meant disagreements among their army and navy branches. Both sides start the campaign scenario under strategic agreement, but there are some events played by the opponent player which may flip the strategic agreement marker into inter-service rivalry. And of course, there are events that fix it. But as long as this remains in inter-service rivalry, players cannot use both army and navy units in the same offensive. This applies on the Japanese army and navy units, for example, if we are talking about the Japanese player. So if it is in inter-service rivalry, or ISR for short, we cannot use both Zuiho and the Air Division, for example, because they belong to different branches. So during this time, you can only combine your naval units with some marines, for example, to conduct some amphibious assaults, or you can use your armies and air forces in order to conduct some ground operations, but you cannot combine them in any other way. Also, for the Japanese, this means that they can only use half their amphibious shipping points, round up. So, for example, if they have 7 amphibious shipping points available, which is the case for the start of the campaign scenario, they can only use up to 4 amphibious shipping points during a turn in which they are under ISR, or inter-service rivalry. Also, I remind you that if the Allied submarine warfare roll, which is rolled at the start of every turn, is successful, then they also lose 1 amphibious shipping point, which combined with inter-service rivalry can create additional problems, because imagine you are Japanese and the Americans roll successfully at the start of the turn and they reduce your hand by 1 card, and they also reduce your amphibious shipping points, and you're under inter-service rivalry. Now in this case you can only use 3 out of your 6 amphibious shipping points. Also, there is an additional effect for the Allied player when they are under inter-service rivalry, and this is that their reinforcements are automatically delayed. I mean, whether the war in Europe track is on positive levels or not, their reinforcements are always delayed if they are under inter-service rivalry. However, in this case, if they are on +1 and the sole reason for their reinforcements being delayed is the inter-service rivalry, then they don't have to roll for Europe. They just have their reinforcements delayed as normally. And there's this one reminder for the war in Europe rolls, which states that when there's inter-service rivalry for the Allies, their war in Europe roll is modified by -1. So this 0 to 1 suddenly becomes 0 to 2 because of the inter-service rivalry. So this is particularly painful for the allies to be under inter-service rivalry because, as previously mentioned, you cannot use your amphibious shipping points to invade one hex islands with your army units. You have to first use a marine unit to amphibiously invade, and only then an army unit may follow. And this is not possible under ISR. So, for example, if the Japanese have sufficiently garrisoned Midway, this is practically impossible for the Americans to retake because they have used the Marine unit, and then they cannot complement this amphibious assault with their army units because of the inter-service rivalry. They can only use US Navy units or US Army units, but not both in the same offensive. And if they only use this one guy, he will probably fail to conduct the amphibious assault. However, the counter to that would be these guys, the joint headquarters, which can work because the restriction is only for US Army and Navy units. So, for example, you can combine Commonwealth Army or Commonwealth Navy or Air units and combine those with either US Army or US Navy units. So, since joint headquarters can activate both Commonwealth and US units, you can, for example, combine an army with a US naval unit, but again, you cannot combine Commonwealth with both US Navy and US Army units. You have to choose one of the two if you are at joint headquarters.